The Damned by Algernon Blackwood. Chapter 5. We were left delightfully to ourselves in this pretentious country mansion with the soul of a villa. Frances took up her painting again, and, the weather being propitious, spent hours out of doors, sketching flowers, trees, and nooks of woodland, garden, even the house itself where bits of it peered suggestively across the orchards. Mrs. Franklyn seemed always busy about something or other, and never interfered with us except to propose motoring, tea in another part of the lawn, and so forth. She flitted everywhere, preoccupied, yet apparently doing nothing. The house engulfed her rather. No visitor called. For one thing, she was not supposed to be back from abroad yet. And for another, I think, the neighborhood, her husband's neighborhood, was puzzled by her sudden cessation from good works. Brigades and temperance societies did not ask to hold their meetings in the big hall, and the vicar arranged the school treats in another's field without explanation. The full-length portrait in the dining room, and the presence of the housekeeper with the burnt-back hair, indeed, were the only reminders of the man who once had lived here. Mrs. Marsh retained her place in silence, well-paid sinecure as it doubtless was, yet with no hint of that suppressed disapproval one might have expected from her. Indeed, there was nothing positive to disapprove, since nothing worldly entered grounds or building. In her master's lifetime she had been another brand snatched from the burning, and it had then been her custom to give vociferous testimony at the revival meetings where he adorned the platform and led in streams of prayer. I saw her sometimes on the stairs, hovering, wandering, half watching and half listening, and the idea came to me once that this woman somehow formed a link with the departed influence of her bigoted employer. She, alone among us, belonged to the house, and looked at home there. When I saw her talking, with such correct and respectful mien to Mrs. Franklyn, I had the feeling that for all her unaggressive attitude, she yet exerted some influence that sought to make her mistress stay in the building forever, live there. She would prevent her escape, prevent getting it straight again, thwart somehow her will to freedom, if she could. The idea in me was of the most fleeting kind. But another time, when I came down late at night to get a book from the library antechamber, and found her sitting in the hall alone, the impression left upon me was the reverse of fleeting. I can never forget the vivid, disagreeable effect it produced upon me. What was she doing there at 11:30 at night, all alone in the darkness? She was sitting upright, stiff, in a big chair below the clock. It gave me a turn. It was so incongruous and odd. She rose quietly as I turned the corner of the stairs, and asked me respectfully, her eyes cast down as usual, whether I had finished with the library, so that she might lock up. There was no more to it than that, but the picture stayed with me unpleasantly. These various impressions came to me at odd moments, of course, and not in a single sequence, as I now relate them. I was hard at work before 3 days were past, not writing, as explained, but reading, making notes, and gathering material from the library for future use. It was in chance moments that these curious flashes came, catching me unawares with a touch of surprise that sometimes made me start. For they proved that my undermind was still conscious of the shadow, and that far away out of sight lay the cause of it that left me with a vague unrest, unsettled, seeking to nest in a place that did not want me. Only when this deeper part knows harmony, perhaps, can good brainwork result, and my inability to write was thus explained. Certainly I was always seeking for something here. I could not find an explanation that continually evaded me. Nothing but these trivial hints offered themselves. Lumped together, however, they had the effect of defining the shadow a little. I became more and more aware of its very real existence. And, if I have made little mention of Frances and my hostess in this connection, it is because they contributed at first little or nothing towards the discovery of what this story tries to tell. Our life was wholly external, normal, quiet and uneventful. Conversation banal, Mrs. Franklyn's conversation in particular. They said nothing that suggested revelation. Both were in this shadow, and both knew that they were in it. But neither betrayed by word or act a hint of interpretation. They talked privately, no doubt, but of that I can report no details. And so it was that, after 10 days of a very commonplace visit, I found myself looking straight into the face of a strangeness that defied capture at close quarters. "There's something here that never happens," were the words that rose in my mind, and that's why none of us can speak of it. And as I looked out of the window and watched the vulgar blackbirds with toes turned in, boring out their worms, I realized sharply that even they, as indeed everything large and small in the house and grounds, shared this strangeness, and were twisted out of normal appearance because of it. Life, as expressed in the entire place, was crumpled, dwarfed, emasculated. God's meanings here were crippled. His love of joy was stunted. Nothing in the garden danced or sang. There was hate in it. The shadow, my thought hurried on to completion, is a manifestation of hate, and hate is the devil. And then I sat back frightened in my chair, for I knew that I had partly found the truth. Leaving my books, I went out into the open. The sky was overcast, yet the day by no means gloomy, for a soft, diffused light oozed through the clouds and turned all things warm and almost summery. But I saw the grounds now in their nakedness because I understood. Hate means strife, and the two together weave the robe that terror wears. Having no so-called religious beliefs myself, nor belonging to any set of dogmas called a creed, I could stand outside these feelings and observe. Yet they soaked into me sufficiently for me to grasp sympathetically what others, with more cabin souls I flattered myself, might feel. That picture in the dining room stalked everywhere, hid behind every tree, peered down upon me from the peaked ugliness of the bourgeois towers, and left the impress of its powerful hand upon every bed of flowers. "You must not do this, you must not do that," went past me through the air. "You must not leave these narrow paths," said the rigid iron railings of black. "You shall not walk here," was written on the lawns. "Keep to the steps. Don't pick the flowers, make no noise of laughter. Singing, dancing, was placarded all over the rose garden. And trespassers will be not prosecuted, but destroyed." Hung from the crest of monkey tree and holly, guarding the ends of each artificial terrace stood gaunt, implacable policemen, warders, jailers. "Come with us," they chanted, "or be damned eternally." I remember feeling quite pleased with myself that I had discovered this obvious explanation of the prison feeling the place breathed out. That the posthumous influence of heavy old Samuel Franklyn might be an inadequate solution did not occur to me. By getting the place straight again, his widow, of course, meant forgetting the glamour of fear and foreboding his depressing creed had temporarily forced upon her, and Francis, delicately minded being, did not speak of it because it was the influence of the man her friend had loved. I felt lighter. A load was lifted from me. "To trace the unfamiliar to the familiar," came back a sentence I had read somewhere, "is to understand." It was a real relief. I could talk with Francis now, even with my hostess, no danger of treading clumsily, for the key was in my hands. I might even help to dissipate the shadow, to get it straight again. It seemed perhaps our long invitation was explained. I went into the house, laughing at myself a little. Perhaps after all the artist's outlook, with no hard and fast dogmas, is as narrow as the others. How small humanity is. And why is there no possible and true combination of all outlooks? The feeling of unsettling was very strong in me just then, in spite of my big discovery, which was to clear everything up. And at the moment I ran into Frances on the stairs, with a portfolio of sketches under her arm. It came across me then abruptly that, although she had worked a great deal since we came, she had shown me nothing. It struck me suddenly as odd, unnatural. The way she tried to pass me now confirmed my newborn suspicion that well, that her results were hardly what they ought to be. "Stand and deliver," I laughed, stepping in front of her. "I've seen nothing you've done since you've been here, and as a rule you show me all your things. I believe they are atrocious and degrading." Then my laughter froze. She made a sly gesture to slip past me, and I almost decided to let her go, for the expression that flashed across her face shocked me. She looked uncomfortable and ashamed. The color came and went a moment in her cheeks, making me think of a child detected in some secret naughtiness. It was almost fear. "It's because they're not finished, then," I said, dropping the tone of banter, "or because they're too good for me to understand." For my criticism of painting, she told me, was crude and ignorant sometimes. "But you'll let me see them later, won't you?" Frances, however, did not take the way of escape I offered. She changed her mind. She drew the portfolio from beneath her arm instead. "You can see them if you really want to, Bill," she said quietly, and her tone reminded me of a nurse who says to a boy just grown out of childhood, "You are old enough now to look upon horror and ugliness only. I don't advise it." "I do want to," I said, and made to go downstairs with her. But instead she said in the same low voice as before, "Come up to my room. We shall be undisturbed there." So I guessed that she had been on her way to show the paintings to our hostess, but did not care for us all three to see them together. My mind worked furiously. "Mabel asked me to do them," she explained in a tone of submissive horror once the door was shut. "In fact, she begged it of me. You know how persistent she is in her quiet way. I had to." She flushed and opened the portfolio on the little table by the window, standing behind me as I turned the sketches over sketches of the grounds and trees and garden. In the first moment of inspection, however, I did not take in clearly why my sister's sense of modesty had been offended, for my attention flashed a second elsewhere. Another bit of the puzzle had dropped into place, defining still further the nature of what I called the shadow. Mrs. Franklyn, I now remembered, had suggested to me in the library that I might perhaps write something about the place, and I had taken it for one of her banal sentences and paid no further attention. I realized now that it was said in earnest. She wanted our interpretations, as expressed in our respective talents, painting and writing. Her invitation was explained. She left us to ourselves on purpose. "I should like to tear them up," Frances was whispering behind me with a shudder. "Only I promised—" She hesitated a moment. "Promised not to?" I asked with a queer feeling of distress, my eyes glued to the papers. "Promised always to show them to her first," she finished so low I barely caught it. I have no intuitive, immediate grasp of the value of paintings. Results come to me slowly, and though everyone believes his own judgment to be good, I dare not claim that mine is worth more than that of any other layman. Frances had too often convicted me of gross ignorance and error. I can only say that I examined these sketches with a feeling of amazement that contained revulsion, if not actually horror and disgust. They were outrageous. I felt hot for my sister, and it was a relief to know she had moved across the room on some pretense or other and did not examine them with me. Her talent, of course, is mediocre, yet she has her moments of inspiration moments. That is to say, when a view of beauty, not normally her own flames divinely through her. And these interpretations, struck me forcibly as being thus inspired, not her own. They were uncommonly well done. They were also atrocious. The meaning in them, however, was never more than hinted. There the unholy skill and power came in. They suggested so abominably, leaving most to the imagination. To find such significance in a bourgeois villa garden, and to interpret it with such delicate yet legible certainty, was a kind of symbolism that was sinister, even diabolical. The delicacy was her own, but the point of view was another's, and the word that rose in my mind was not the gross description of impure, but the more fundamental qualification, unpure. In silence I turned the sketches over one by one, as a boy hurries through the pages of an evil book lest he be caught. "What does Mabel do with them?" I asked presently in a low tone as I neared the end. "Does she keep them?" "She makes notes about them in a book and then destroys them," was the reply from the end of the room. I heard a sigh of relief. "I'm glad you've seen them, Bill. I wanted you to, but was afraid to show them. You understand?" "I understand," was my reply, though it was not a question intended to be answered. All I understood really was that Mabel's mind was as sweet and pure as my sister's, and that she had some good reason for what she did. She destroyed the sketches, but first made notes. It was an interpretation of the place she sought. Brother-like, I felt resentment, though, that Frances should waste her time and talent when she might be doing work that she could sell. Naturally, I felt other things as well. "Mabel pays me 5 guineas for each one," I heard. "Absolutely insists." I stared at her stupidly a moment, bereft of speech or wit. "I must either accept or go away," she went on calmly, but a little white. "I've tried everything. There was a scene the 3rd day I was here, when I showed her my first result. I wanted to write to you, but hesitated." "It's unintentional, then, on your part. Forgive my asking it, Frances, dear," I blundered, hardly knowing what to think or say. Between the lines of her letter came back to me. "I mean, you make the sketches in your ordinary way, and the result comes out of itself, so to speak." She nodded, throwing her hands out like a Frenchman. "We needn't keep the money for ourselves, Bill. We can give it away, but I must either accept or leave." And she repeated the shrugging gesture. She sat down on the chair facing me, staring helplessly at the carpet. "You say there was a scene?" I went on presently. "She insisted?" "She begged me to continue," my sister replied very quietly. "She thinks, that is, she has an idea, or theory, that there's something about the place, something she can't get at quite." Frances stammered badly. She knew I did not encourage her wild theories. "Something she feels, yes." I helped her, more than curious. "Oh, you know what I mean, Bill," she said desperately. "That the place is saturated with some influence, that she is herself too positive or too stupid to interpret. She's trying to make herself negative and receptive, as she calls it, but can't, of course, succeed. Haven't you noticed how dull and impersonal and insipid she seems, as though she had no personality? She thinks impressions will come to her that way, but they don't." "Naturally. So she's trying me, us, what she calls the sensitive and impressionable artistic temperament. She says that until she is sure exactly what this influence is, she can't fight it, turn it out, get the house straight, as she phrases it." Remembering my own singular impressions, I felt more lenient than I might otherwise have done. I tried to keep impatience out of my voice. "And this influence, whose is it?" We used the pronoun that followed in the same breath, for I answered my own question at the same moment as she did, his. Our heads nodded involuntarily towards the floor, the dining room being directly underneath, and my heart sank. My curiosity died away on the instant. I felt bored. A commonplace haunted house was the last thing in the world to amuse or interest me. The mere thought exasperated with its suggestions of imagination, overwrought nerves, hysteria, and the rest. Mingled with my other feelings was certainly disappointment. To see a figure or feel a presence, and report from day to day strange incidents to each other, would be a form of weariness I could never tolerate. "But really, Francis," I said firmly, after a moment's pause, "it's too far-fetched, this explanation. A curse, you know, belongs to the ghost stories of early Victorian days. And only my positive conviction that there was something after all worth discovering, and that it most certainly was not this, prevented my suggesting that we terminate our visit forthwith, or as soon as we decently could. This is not a haunted house, whatever it is," I concluded somewhat vehemently, bringing my hand down upon her odious portfolio. My sister's reply revived my curiosity sharply. "I was waiting for you to say that. Mabel says exactly the same. He is in it, but it's something more than that alone, something far bigger and more complicated." Her sentence seemed to indicate the sketches, and though I caught the inference, I did not take it up, having no desire to discuss them with her, just them indeed, if ever. I merely stared at her and listened. Questions, I felt sure, would be of little use. It was better she should say her thought in her own way. "He is one influence, the most recent," she went on slowly, and always very calmly. "But there are others, deeper layers, as it were, underneath. If his were the only one, something would happen. But nothing ever does happen. The others hinder and prevent, as though each were struggling to predominate. I had felt it already myself. The idea was rather horrible. I shivered. That's what is so ugly about it, that nothing ever happens," she said. "There is this endless anticipation always on the dry edge of a result that never materializes. It is torture. Mabel is at her wit's end, you see. And when she begged me, what I felt about my sketches, I mean." She stammered badly as before. I stopped her. I had judged too hastily. That queer symbolism in her paintings, pagan and yet not innocent, was, I understood, the result of mixture. I did not pretend to understand, but at least I could be patient. I consequently held my peace. We did talk on a little longer, but it was more general talk that avoided successfully our hostess, the paintings, wild theories, and him until, at length, the emotion Francis had hitherto so successfully kept under burst vehemently forth again. It had hidden between her calm sentences, as it had hidden between the lines of her letter. It swept her now from head to foot, packed tight in the thing she then said. "Then, Bill, if it is not an ordinary haunted house," she asked, "what is it?" The words were commonplace enough. The emotion was in the tone of her voice that trembled, in the gesture she made, leaning forward and clasping both hands upon her knees, and in the slight blanching of her cheeks as her brave eyes asked the question and searched my own with anxiety that bordered upon panic. In that moment she put herself under my protection. I winced. "And why?" she added, lowering her voice to a still and furtive whisper. "Does nothing ever happen?" If only, this with great emphasis, something would happen, break this awful tension, bring relief. It's the waiting I cannot stand. And she shivered all over as she said it, a touch of wildness in her eyes. I would have given much to have made a true and satisfactory answer. My mind searched frantically for a moment, but in vain. There lay no sufficient answer in me. I felt what she felt, though with differences. No conclusive explanation lay within reach. Nothing happened. Eager as I was to shoot the entire business into the rubbish heap where ignorance and superstition discharged their poisonous weeds, I could not honestly accomplish this. To treat Francis as a child and merely explain away would be to strain her confidence in my protection, so affectionately claimed. It would further be dishonest to myself weak, besides to deny that I had also felt the strain and tension, even as she did. While my mind continued searching, I returned her stare in silence, and Frances then, with more honesty and insight than my own, gave suddenly the answer herself, an answer whose truth and adequacy, so far as they went, I could not readily gainsay. I think, Bill, because it is too big to happen here to happen anywhere, indeed, all at once, and too awful. To have tossed the sentence aside as nonsense, argued it away, proved that it was really meaningless, would have been easy at any other time or in any other place, and, had the past week brought me none of the vivid impressions it had brought me, this is doubtless what I should have done. My narrowness again was proved. We understand in others only what we have in ourselves. But her explanation, in a measure, I knew was true. It hinted at the strife and struggle that my notion of a shadow had seemed to cover thinly. Perhaps, I murmured lamely, waiting in vain for her to say more. But you said just now that you felt the thing was in layers, as it were. Do you mean each influence fighting for the upper hand? I used her phraseology to conceal my own poverty. Terminology, after all, was nothing, provided we could reach the idea itself. Her eyes said yes. She had her clear conception, arrived at independently, as was her way. And, unlike her sex, she kept it clear, unsmothered by too many words. One set of influences gets at me, another gets at you. It's according to our temperaments, I think. She glanced significantly at the vile portfolio. Sometimes they are mixed, and therefore false. There's always been in me, more than in you, the pagan thing, perhaps, though never, thank God, like that. The frank confession, of course, invited my own, as it was meant to do. Yet it was difficult to find the words. What I have felt in this place, Frances, I honestly can hardly tell you, because my impressions have not arranged themselves in any definite form I can describe. The strife, the agony of vainly sought escape, and the unrest, a sort of prison atmosphere, this I have felt at different times and with varying degrees of strength, but I find as yet no final label to attach. I couldn't say pagan, Christian, or anything like that, I mean as you do. As with the blind and deaf, you may have an intensification of certain senses denied to me, or even another sense altogether in embryo. Perhaps, she stopped me, anxious to keep to the point. You feel it as Mabel does. She feels the whole thing complete. That also is possible, I said very slowly. I was thinking behind my words. Her odd remark that it was big and awful came back upon me as true. A vast sensation of distress and discomfort swept me suddenly. Pity was in it, and a fierce contempt, a savage, bitter anger as well. Fury against some sham authority was part of it. Frances, I said, caught unawares and dropping all pretense, what in the world can it be? I looked hard at her. For some minutes neither of us spoke. Have you felt no desire to interpret it? She asked presently. Mabel did suggest my writing something about the house, was my reply. But I felt nothing imperative. That sort of writing is not my line, you know. My only feeling, I added, noticing that she waited for more, is the impulse to explain, discover, get it out of me somehow, and so get rid of it. Not by writing, though, as yet. And again I repeated my former question, what in the world do you think it is? My voice had become involuntarily hushed. There was awe in it. Her answer, given with slow emphasis, brought back all my reserve. The phraseology provoked me rather. Whatever it is, Bill, it is not of God. I got up to go downstairs. I believe I shrugged my shoulders. "Would you like to leave, Francis? Shall we go back to town?" I suggested this at the door, and hearing no immediate reply, I turned back to look. Francis was sitting with her head bowed over and buried in her hands. The attitude horribly suggested tears. No woman, I realized, can keep back the pressure of strong emotion as long as Francis had done, without ending in a fluid collapse. I waited a moment uneasily, longing to comfort, yet afraid to act, and in this way discovered the existence of the appalling emotion in myself, hitherto but half-guessed. At all costs a scene must be prevented. It would involve such exaggeration and overstatement. Brutally, such is the weakness of the ordinary man. I turned the handle to go out, but my sister then raised her head. The sunlight caught her face, framed untidily in its auburn hair, and I saw her wonderful expression with a start. Pity, tenderness, and sympathy shone in it like a flame. It was undeniable. There shone through all her features the imperishable love and yearning to sacrifice self for others which I have seen in only one type of human being. It was the great mother look. "We must stay by Mabel and help her get it straight," she whispered, making the decision for us both. I murmured agreement. Abashed and half ashamed, I stole softly from the room and went out into the grounds. And the first thing clearly realized when alone was this, that the long scene between us was without definite result. The exchange of confidence was really nothing but hints and vague suggestion. We had decided to stay, but it was a negative decision not to leave rather than a positive action. All our words and questions, our guesses, inferences, explanations, our most subtle allusions and insinuations, even the odious paintings themselves, were without definite result. Nothing had happened. Chapter 6. And instinctively, once alone, I made for the places where she had painted her extraordinary pictures. I tried to see what she had seen. Perhaps, now that she had opened my mind to another view, I should be sensitive to some similar interpretation, and possibly by way of literary expression. If I were to write about the place, I asked myself, how should I treat it? I deliberately invited an interpretation in the way that came easiest to me writing. But in this case, there came no such revelation. Looking closely at the trees and flowers, the bits of lawn and terrace, the rose garden and corner of the house where the flaming creeper hung so thickly, I discovered nothing of the odious, unpure thing her colour and grouping had unconsciously revealed. At first, that is, I discovered nothing. The reality stood there, commonplace and ugly, side by side with her distorted version of it that lay in my mind. It seemed incredible. I tried to force it, but in vain. My imagination ploughed less deeply than hers, or to another pattern, grew different seed. Where I saw the gross soul of an overgrown suburban garden, inspired by the spirit of a vulgar, rich revivalist who loved to preach damnation, she saw this rush of pagan liberty and joy, this strange license of primitive flesh which, tainted by the other, produced the adulterated, vile result. Certain things, however, gradually then became apparent, forcing themselves upon me, willy-nilly. They came slowly, but overwhelmingly. Not that facts had changed, or natural details altered in the grounds. This was impossible. But that I noticed for the first time various aspects I had not noticed before trivial enough. Yet for me, just then, significant. Some I remembered from previous days. Others I saw now as I wandered to and fro, uneasy, uncomfortable, Bickle almost, it seemed, watched by someone who took note of my impressions. The details were so foolish, the total result so formidable. I was half aware that others tried hard to make me see. It was deliberate. My sister's phrase, "One layer got at me, another gets at you," flashed undesired, upon me. For I saw, as with the eyes of a child, what I can only call a goblin garden house. Grounds, trees, and flowers belong to a goblin world that children enter through the pages of their fairy tales. And what made me first aware of it was the whisper of the wind behind me, so that I turned with a sudden start, feeling that something had moved closer. An old ash tree, ugly and ungainly, had been artificially trained to form an arbor at one end of the terrace that was a tennis lawn, and the leaves of it now went rustling together, swishing as they rose and fell. I looked at the ash tree and felt as though I had passed that moment between doors into this goblin garden that crouched behind the real one. Below, at a deeper layer perhaps, lay hidden the one my sister had entered. To deal with my own, however, I call it goblin, because an odd aspect of the quaint in it yet never quite achieved the picturesque. Grotesque probably is the truer word, for everywhere I noticed, and for the first time, this slight alteration of the natural due, either to the exaggeration of some detail, or to its suppression, generally, I think, to the latter. Life everywhere appeared to me as blocked from the full delivery of its sweet and lovely message. Some counter-influence stopped its suppression, or sent it a wry exaggeration. The house itself, mere expression, of course, of a narrow, limited mind, was sheer ugliness. It required no further explanation. With the grounds and garden, so far as shape and general plan were concerned, this was also true, but that trees and flowers and other natural details should share the same deficiency perplexed my logical soul, and even dismayed it. I stood and stared, then moved about, and stood and stared again. Everywhere was this mockery of a sinister, unfinished aspect. I sought in vain to recover my normal point of view. My mind had found this goblin garden and wandered to and fro in it, unable to escape. The change was in myself, of course, and so trivial were the details which illustrated it that they sound absurd, thus mentioned one by one. For me, they proved it, is all I can affirm. The goblin touch lay plainly everywhere, in the forms of the trees, planted at neat intervals along the lawns, in this twisted ash that rustled just behind me, in the shadow of the gloomy Wellingtonias, whose sweeping skirts obscured the grass, but especially, I noticed, in the tops and crests of them. For here, the delicate, graceful curves of last year's growth seemed to shrink back into themselves. None of them pointed upwards. Their life had failed and turned aside just when it should have become triumphant. The character of a tree reveals itself chiefly at the extremities, and it was precisely here that they all drooped and achieved this hint of goblin distortion in the growth, that is, of the last few years. What ought to have been fairy, joyful, natural, was instead uncomely to the verge of the grotesque. Spontaneous expression was arrested. My mind perceived a goblin garden and was caught in it. The place grimaced at me. With the flowers it was similar, though far more difficult to detect in detail for description. I saw the smaller vegetable growth as impish, half malicious. Even the terraces sloped ill, as though their ends had sagged since they had been so lavishly constructed. Their varying angles gave a queerly bewildering aspect to their sequence that was unpleasant to the eye. One might wander among their deceptive lengths and get lost among open terraces, with the house quite close at hand. Unhomely seemed the entire garden, unable to give repose, restlessness in it everywhere, almost strife and discord certainly. Moreover, the garden grew into the house into the garden, and in both was this idea of resistance to the natural, the spirit that says no to joy. All over it I was aware of the effort to achieve another end, the struggle to burst forth and escape into free, spontaneous expression, that should be happy and natural. Yet the effort forever frustrated by the weight of this dark shadow that rendered it abortive. Life crawled aside into a channel that was a cul-de-sac, then turned horribly upon itself. Instead of blossom and fruit, there were weeds. This approach of life I was conscious of. Then dismal failure. There was no fulfillment. Nothing happened. And so, through this singular mood, I came a little nearer to understand the unpure thing that had stammered out into expression through my sister's talent. For the unpure is merely negative. It has no existence. It is but the cramped expression of what is true, stammering its way brokenly over false boundaries that seek to limit and confine. Great, full expression of anything is pure, whereas here was only the incomplete, unfinished, and therefore ugly. There was a strife, and pain, and desire to escape. I found myself shrinking from house and grounds, as one shrinks from the touch of the mentally arrested, those in whom life has turned awry. There was almost mutilation in it. Past items, too, now flocked to confirm this feeling that I walked, liberty captured and half-maimed, in a monstrous garden. I remembered days of rain that refreshed the countryside, but left these grounds cracked with the summer heat, unsatisfied and thirsty, and how the big winds that cleaned the woods and fields elsewhere crawled here with difficulty through the dense foliage that protected the towers from the north and west and east. They were ineffective, sluggish currents. There was no real wind. Nothing happened. I began to realize far more clearly than in my sister's fanciful explanation about layers, that here were many contrary influences at work, mutually destructive of one another. House and grounds were not haunted merely. They were the arena of past thinking and feeling, perhaps of terrible, impure beliefs, each striving to suppress the others, yet no one of them achieving supremacy because no one of them was strong enough, no one of them was true. Each, moreover, tried to win me over, though only one was able to reach my mind at all. For some obscure reason, possibly because my temperament had a natural bias towards the grotesque, it was the goblin lair. With me, it was the line of least resistance. In my own thoughts, this goblin garden revealed, of course, merely my personal interpretation. I felt now objectively what long ago my mind had felt subjectively. My work, essential sign of spontaneous life with me, had stopped dead. Production had become impossible. I stood now considerably closer to the cause of this sterility. The cause, rather, turned bolder, had stepped insolently nearer. Nothing happened anywhere. House, garden, mind alike were barren, abortive, torn by the strife of frustrate impulse, ugly, hateful, sinful. Yet behind it all was still the desire of life-desire to escape accomplish. Hope, an intolerable hope-I, became startlingly a ware-crowned torture. And, realizing this, though in some part of me where reason lost her hold, there rose upon me then another and a darker thing that caught me by the throat and made me shrink with a sense of revulsion that touched actual loathing. I knew instantly whence it came, this wave of abhorrence and disgust, for even while I saw red and felt revolt rise in me, it seemed that I grew partially aware of the layer next below the goblin. I perceived the existence of this deeper stratum. One opened the way for the other, as it were. There were so many, yet all interrelated. To admit one was to clear the way for all. If I lingered, I should be caught horribly. They struggled with such violence for supremacy among themselves, however, that this latest uprising was instantly smothered and crushed back, though not before a glimpse had been revealed to me, and the redness in my thoughts transferred itself to color my surroundings thickly and appallingly with blood. This lurid aspect drenched the garden, smeared the terraces, lent to the very soil a tinge as of sacrificial rites that choked the breath in me, while it seemed to fix me to the earth my feet so longed to leave. It was so revolting that at the same time I felt a dreadful curiosity as of fascination. I wished to stay. Between these contrary impulses, I think I actually reeled a moment, transfixed by a fascination of the awful. Through the lighter goblin veil I felt myself sinking down, 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 down into this turgid lair that was so much more violent and so much more ancient. The upper layer, indeed, seemed fairy by comparison with this terror born of the lust for blood, thick with the anguish of human sacrificial victims. Upper! Then I was already sinking. My feet were caught. I was actually in it. What atavistic strain, hidden deep within me, had been touched into vile response, giving this flash of intuitive comprehension? I cannot say. The coatings laid on by civilization are probably thin enough in all of us. I made a supreme effort. The sun and wind came back. I could almost swear I opened my eyes. Something very atrocious surged back into the depths, carrying with it a thought of tangled woods, of big stones standing in a circle, motionless, white figures, the one form bound with ropes, and the ghastly gleam of the knife. Like smoke upon a battlefield, it rolled away. I was standing on the gravel path below the second terrace when the familiar goblin garden danced back again, doubly grotesque now, doubly mocking, yet, by way of contrast, almost welcome. My glimpse into the depths was momentary, it seems, and had passed utterly away. The common world rushed back with a sense of glad relief, yet ominous now forever, I felt, for the knowledge of what its past had built upon. In street, in theatre, in the festivities of friends, in music-room or playing field, even indeed in church, how could the memory of what I had seen and felt leave its hideous trace? The very structure of my thought, it seemed to me, was stained. What has been thought by others can never be obliterated until, with a start, my reverie broke and fled, scattered by a violent sound that I recognized for the first time in my life as wholly desirable. The returning motor meant that my hostess was back. Yet, so urgent had been my temporary obsession that my first presentation of her was well, not as I knew her now. Floating along with a face of anguished torture, I saw Mabel, a mere effigy captured by others' thinking, pass down into those depths of fire and blood that only just had closed beneath my feet. She dipped away. She vanished. Her fading eyes turned to the last towards some savior who had failed her. And that strange, intolerable hope was in her face. The mystery of the place was pretty thick about me just then. It was the fall of dusk, and the ghost of slanting sunshine was as unreal as though badly painted. The garden stood at attention all about me. I cannot explain it, but I can tell it, I think, exactly as it happened. For it remains vivid in me forever, that for the first time something almost happened. Myself apparently the combining link through which it pressed towards delivery. I had already turned towards the house. In my mind were pictures, not actual thoughts of the motor. Tea on the veranda. My sister, Mabel. When there came behind me this tumultuous, awful rush as I left the garden. The ugliness, the pain, the striving to escape, the whole negative and suppressed agony that was the place, focused that second into a concentrated effort to produce a result. It was a blinding tempest of long, frustrate desire that heaved at me, surging appallingly behind me like an anguished mob. I was in the act of crossing the frontier into my normal self again, when it came, catching fearfully at my skirts. I might use an entire dictionary of descriptive adjectives, yet come no nearer to it than this. The conception of a huge assemblage determined to escape with me, or to snatch me back among themselves. My legs trembled for an instant, and I caught my breath, then turned and ran as fast as possible up the ugly terraces. At the same instant, as though the clanging of an iron gate cut short the unfinished phrase, I thought the beginning of an awful thing, the damned. Like this it rushed after me from that goblin garden that had sought to keep me, the damned, for there was sound in it. I know full well it was subjective, not actually heard at all, yet somehow sound was in it, a great volume, roaring and booming thunderously, far away and below me. The sentence dipped back into the depths that gave it birth. Unfinished, its completion was prevented. As usual, nothing happened. But it drove behind me like a hurricane as I ran towards the house, and the sound of it I can only liken to those terrible undertones you may hear standing beside Niagara. They lie behind the mere crash of the falling flood, within it somehow, not audible to all felt rather than definitely heard. It seemed to echo back from the surface of those sagging terraces as I flew across their sloping ends, for it was somehow underneath them. It was in the rustle of the wind that stirred the skirts of the drooping Wellingtonias. The beds of formal flowers passed it on to the creepers, red as blood, that crept over the unsightly building. Into the structure of the vulgar and forbidding house it sank away. The towers took it home. The uncomely doors and windows seemed almost like mouths that had uttered the words themselves, and on the upper floors at that very moment I saw two maids in the act of closing them again. And on the veranda, as I arrived breathless and shaken in my soul, Francis and Mabel, standing by the tea-table, looked up to greet me. In the faces of both were clearly legible the signs of shock. They watched me coming, yet so full of their own distress that they hardly noticed the state in which I came. In the face of my hostess, however, I read another and a bigger thing than in the face of Francis. Mabel knew. She had experienced what I had experienced. She had heard that awful sentence I had heard, but heard it not for the first time. Heard it, moreover, I verily believe, complete and to its dreadful end. "Bill, did you hear that curious noise just now?" Francis asked it sharply before I could say a word. Her manner was confused. She looked straight at me, and there was a tremor in her voice she could not hide. "There's wind about," I said. "Wind in the trees and sweeping round the walls. It's risen rather suddenly." My voice faltered rather. "No, it wasn't wind," she insisted, with a significance meant for me alone, but badly hidden. "It was more like distant thunder, we thought. How you ran too," she added. "What a pace you came across the terraces." I knew instantly from the way she said it that they both had already heard the sound before, and were anxious to know if I had heard it, and how. My interpretation was what they sought. It was a curiously deep sound, I admit. It may have been big guns at sea, I suggested. Forts or cruisers practicing. The coast isn't so very far, and with the wind in the right direction. The expression on Mabel's face stopped me dead. "Like huge doors closing," she said softly in her colorless voice. "Enormous metal doors shutting against a mass of people clamoring to get out." The gravity, the note of hopelessness in her tones, was shocking. Francis had gone into the house the instant Mabel began to speak. "I'm cold," she had said. "I think I'll get a shawl." Mabel and I were alone. I believe it was the first time we had been really alone since I arrived. She looked up from the teacups, fixing her pallid eyes on mine. She had made a question of the sentence. "You hear it like that?" I asked innocently. I purposely used the present tense. She changed her stare from one eye to the other. It was absolutely expressionless. My sister's step sounded on the floor of the room behind us. "If only," Mabel began, then stopped, and my own feelings leaping out instinctively completed the sentence I felt was in her mind. Something would happen. She instantly corrected me. I had caught her thought, yet somehow phrased it wrongly. We could escape. She lowered her tone a little, saying it hurriedly. The "we" amazed and horrified me, but something in her voice and manner struck me utterly dumb. There was ice and terror in it. It was a dying woman speaking, a lost and hopeless soul. In that atrocious moment, I hardly noticed what was said exactly, but I remember that my sister returned with a grey shawl about her shoulders, and that Mabel said, in her ordinary voice again, "It is chilly, yes. Let's have tea inside," and that two maids, one of them the grenadier, speedily carried the loaded trays into the morning room and put a match to the logs in the great open fireplace. It was, after all, foolish to risk the sharp evening air, for dusk was falling steadily, and even the sunshine of the day just fading could not turn autumn into summer. I was the last to come in. Just as I left the veranda, a large black bird swooped down in front of me past the pillars. It dropped from overhead, swerved abruptly to one side as it caught sight of me, and flapped heavily towards the shrubberies on the left of the terraces, where it disappeared into the gloom. It flew very low, very close. And it startled me. I think because in some way it seemed like my shadow materialized as though the dark horror that was rising everywhere from house and garden, then settling back so thickly yet so imperceptibly upon us all, were incarnated in that whirring creature that passed between the daylight and the coming night. I stood a moment, wondering if it would appear again, before I followed the others indoors, and as I was in the act of closing the windows after me, I caught a glimpse of a figure on the lawn. It was some distance away, on the other side of the shrubberies, in fact where the bird had vanished. But in spite of the twilight that half magnified, half obscured it, the identity was unmistakable. I knew the housekeeper's stiff walk too well to be deceived. "Mrs. Marsh taking the air," I said to myself. I felt the necessity of saying it, and I wondered why she was doing so at this particular hour. If I had other thoughts, they were so vague, and so quickly and utterly suppressed, that I cannot recall them sufficiently to relate them here. And, once indoors, it was to be expected that there would come explanation, discussion, conversation, at any rate, regarding the singular noise and its cause, some uttered evidence of the mood that had been strong enough to drive us all inside. Yet there was none. Each of us purposely, and with various skill, ignored it. We talked little, and when we did it was of anything in the world but that. Personally, I experienced a touch of that same bewilderment which had come over me during my first talk with Francis on the evening of my arrival, for I recall now the acute tension, and the hope, yet dread, that one or other of us must sooner or later introduce the subject. It did not happen, however. No reference was made to it even remotely. It was the presence of Mabel, I felt positive, that prohibited. As soon might we have discussed death in the bedroom of a dying woman. The only scrap of conversation I remember, where all was ordinary and commonplace, was when Mabel spoke casually to the grenadier, asking why Mrs. Marsh had omitted to do something or other, what it was I forget, and that the maid replied respectfully that Mrs. Marsh was very sorry, but her and still pained her. I inquired, though so casually that I scarcely know what prompted the words, whether she had injured herself severely, and the reply, "She upset a lamp and burnt herself," was said in a tone that made me feel my curiosity was indiscreet. But she always has an excuse for not doing things she ought to do. The little bit of conversation remained with me, and I remember particularly the quick way Francis interrupted and turned the talk upon the delinquencies of servants in general, telling incidents of her own at our flat with a volubility that perhaps seemed forced, and that certainly did not encourage general talk as it may have been intended to do. We lapsed into silence immediately she finished. But for all our care and all our calculated silence, each knew that something had, in these last moments, come very close. It had brushed us in passing. It had retired. And I am inclined to think now that the large dark thing I saw, riding the dusk, probably bird of prey, was in some sense a symbol of it in my mind, that actually there had been no bird at all, I mean, but that my mood of apprehension and dismay had formed the vivid picture in my thoughts. It had swept past us, it had retreated, but it was now, at this moment, in hiding very close. And it was watching us. Perhaps, too, it was mere coincidence that I encountered Mrs. Marsh, his housekeeper, several times that evening in the short interval between tea and dinner, and that on each occasion the sight of this gaunt, half-saturnine woman fed my prejudice against her. Once, on my way to the telephone, I ran into her just where the passage is somewhat jammed by a square table carrying the Chinese gong, a grandfather's clock and a box of croquet mallets. We both gave way, then both advanced, then again gave way simultaneously. It seemed impossible to pass. We stepped with decision to the same side, finally colliding in the middle, while saying those futile little things, half apology, half excuse, that are inevitable at such times. In the end she stood upright against the wall for me to pass, taking her place against the very door I wished to open. It was ludicrous. "Excuse me, I was just going in to telephone," I explained. And she sidled off, murmuring apologies, but opening the door for me while she did so. Our hands met a moment on the handle. There was a second's awkwardness. It was too stupid. I remembered her injury, and by way of something to say, I inquired after it. She thanked me. It was entirely healed now, but it might have been much worse. And there was something about the mercy of the Lord that I didn't quite catch. While telephoning, however, London call, and my attention focused on it, realized sharply that this was the first time I had spoken with her. Also, that I had touched her. It happened to be a Sunday, and the lines were clear. I got my connection quickly, and the incident was forgotten while my thoughts went up to London. On my way upstairs, then, the woman came back into my mind, so that I recalled other things about her, how she seemed all over the house, in unlikely places often, how I had caught her sitting in the hall alone that night, how she was forever coming and going with her lugubrious visage and that untidy hair at the back that had made me laugh 3 years ago with the idea that it looked singed or burnt, and how the impression on my first arrival at the Towers was that this woman somehow kept alive, though its evidence was outwardly suppressed, the influence of her late employer and of his somber teachings. Somewhere with her was associated the idea of punishment, vindictiveness, revenge. I remembered again suddenly my odd notion that she sought to keep her present mistress here, a prisoner in this bleak and comfortless house, and that really, in spite of her obsequious silence, she was intensely opposed to the change of thought that had reclaimed Mabel to a happier view of life. All this in a passing second flashed in review before me, and I discovered, or at any rate reconstructed, the real Mrs. Marsh. She was decidedly in the shadow. More, she stood in the forefront of it, stealthily leading an assault, as it were, against the Towers and its occupants, as though, consciously or unconsciously, she labored incessantly to this hateful end. I can only judge that some state of nervousness in me permitted the series of insignificant thoughts to assume this dramatic shape, and that what had gone before prepared the way and led her up at the head of so formidable a procession. I relate it exactly as it came to me. My nerves were doubtless somewhat on edge by now. Otherwise I should hardly have been a prey to the exaggeration at all. I seemed open to so many strange impressions. Nothing else perhaps can explain my ridiculous conversation with her, when, for the 3rd time that evening, I came suddenly upon the woman halfway down the stairs, standing by an open window as if in the act of listening. She was dressed in black, a black shawl over her square shoulders, and black gloves on her big, broad hands. 2 black objects, prayer books apparently, she clasped, and on her head she wore a bonnet with shaking beads of jet. At first I did not know her, as I came running down upon her from the landing. It was only when she stood aside to let me pass that I saw her profile against the tapestry and recognized Mrs. Marsh. And to catch her on the front stairs, dressed like this, struck me as incongruous impertinent. I paused in my dangerous descent. Through the open window came the sound of bells, church bells, a sound more depressing to me than superstition, and as nauseating. Though the action was ill-judged, I obeyed the sudden prompting. Was it a secret desire to attack, perhaps, and spoke to her. "Been to church, I suppose, Mrs. Marsh," I said. "Or just going, perhaps." Her face, as she looked up a second to reply, was like an iron doll that moved its lips and turned its eyes, but made no other imitation of life at all. "Some of us still goes, sir," she said unctuously. It was respectful enough, yet the implied judgment of the rest of the world made me almost angry. A deferential insolence lay behind the affected meekness. "For those who believe, no doubt it is helpful," I smiled. "True religion brings peace and happiness, I'm sure, Joy, Mrs. Marsh, joy." I found keen satisfaction in the emphasis. She looked at me like a knife. I cannot describe the implacable thing that shone in her fixed, stern eyes, nor the shadow of felt darkness that stole across her face. She glittered. I felt hate in her. I knew, she knew, too, who was in the thoughts of us both at that moment. She replied softly, never forgetting her place for an instant, "There is joy, sir, in heaven over one sinner that repenteth, and in church there goes up prayer to God for those who well, for the others, sir. Ooh," she cut short her sentence thus. The gloom about her, as she said it, was like the gloom about a hearse, a tomb, a darkness of great hopeless dungeons. My tongue ran on of itself with a kind of bitter satisfaction. "We must believe there are no others, Mrs. Marsh. Salvation, you know, would be such a failure if there were. No merciful, all-foreseeing God could ever have devised such a fearful plan." Her voice, interrupting me, seemed to rise out of the bowels of the earth. "They rejected the salvation when it was offered to them, sir, on earth." "But you wouldn't have them tortured forever because of one mistake in ignorance," I said, fixing her with my eye. "Come now, would you, Mrs. Marsh? No God worth worshipping could permit such cruelty. Think a moment what it means." She stared at me, a curious expression in her stupid eyes. It seemed to me as though the woman in her revolted, while yet she dared not suffer her grim belief to trip. That is, she would willingly have had it otherwise, but for a terror that prevented. "We may pray for them, sir, and we may hope." She dropped her eyes to the carpet. "Good, good," I put in cheerfully, sorry now that I had spoken at all. "That's more hopeful, at any rate, isn't it?" She murmured something about Abraham's bosom, and the time of salvation not being forever, as I tried to pass her. Then a half gesture that she made stopped me. There was something more she wished to say, to ask. She looked up furtively. In her eyes I saw the woman, peering out through fear. "Perhaps, sir," she faltered, as though lightning must strike her dead. "Perhaps, would you think, a drop of cold water, given in his name, might moisten—" But I stopped her, for the foolish talk had lasted long enough. "Of course," I exclaimed. "Of course, for God is love, remember, and love means charity, tolerance, sympathy, and sparing others pain." And I hurried past her, determined to end the outrageous conversation for which yet I knew myself entirely to blame. Behind me, she stood stock still for several minutes, half bewildered, half alarmed, as I suspected. I caught the fragment of another sentence, one word of it, rather. Punishment, but the rest escaped me. Her arrogance and condescending tolerance exasperated me, while I was at the same time secretly pleased that I might have touched some string of remorse or sympathy in her after all. Her belief was iron. She dared not let it go, yet somewhere underneath there lurked the germ of a wholesome revulsion. She would help them if she dared. Her question proved it. Half ashamed of myself, I turned and crossed the hall quickly lest I should be tempted to say more, and in me was a disagreeable sensation, as though I had just left the incurable ward of some great hospital. A reaction caught me as of nausea. Ugh! I wanted such people cleansed by fire. They seemed to me as centers of contamination whose vicious thoughts flowed out to stain God's glorious world. I saw myself, Francis, Mabel too especially, on the rack, while that odious figure of cruelty and darkness stood over us and ordered the awful handles turned in order that we might be saved, forced, that is, to think and believe exactly as she thought and believed. I found relief for my somewhat childish indignation by letting myself loose upon the organ then. The flood of Bach and Beethoven brought back the sense of proportion. It proved, however, at the same time that there had been this growth of distortion in me, and that it had been provided apparently by my closer contact for the first time with that funereal personality, the woman who, like her master, believed that all holding views of God that differed from her own must be damned eternally. It gave me, moreover, some faint clue, perhaps, though a clue I was unequal of following up, to the nature of the strife and terror and frustrate influence in the house. That housekeeper had to do with it. She kept it alive. Her thought was like a spell she waved above her mistress's head.